So this is why we're here. CSET Foretell has just launched its first issue campaign, and I'll talk more about what that actually means. The topic is, what is the future of the relationship between the US Department of Defense and Silicon Valley? So our issue campaign process has two stages. The first stage involves stakeholders. These are the policymakers and analysts we actually want to be consumers of our forecasts, people we want to influence, and that's now complete. Stage two is the crowd stage. That began last week. We have 20 forecast questions. 13 are currently live. The remaining 7 will go live mostly in the next few days. I think there'll be one that goes live September 1st. And it goes through April 2022. And I'll talk more about what happens in that period. And as I'll get to in a minute, we are hoping to have an initial report that describes the entire process, including the results of the stakeholder and crowd phase. But that requires a critical mass of initial forecast. So we are trying to get a critical mass of forecast by roughly September 17th. So a couple of weeks after that, we can publish a report. So there's a lot new about this process. The methodology we're following is new. The question formats are new. The data display and communication we're using is new. So that's why we're doing this. And obviously, this is still a process that we want to improve over time. So your questions and your feedback will be very instrumental. All right. Okay. Before we talk about the actual issue campaign, let's zoom out and discuss what we're actually trying to do. So broadly, Foretell's mission is to promote forecasting as a practical decision aid. We're targeting policymakers, specifically in the technology security context, but the tools that we're using will be applicable outside of that context. And so I think that the broad mission is forecasting as a decision aid. So why hasn't this already been a solved problem? Phil Tetlock, as I'm sure most of you are familiar with, he runs the Good Judgment Project, and the Good Judgment Project won the IARPA-sponsored ACE tournament between 2010 and 2014, where crowd forecasting was shown to be highly accurate on geopolitical questions. The questions did not actually get, sorry, the forecast on the questions did not get as much traction with decision makers as one might think, given their showing of accuracy. And Tetlock described this problem as the rigor relevance trade-off. And simply stated, the things that we really care about, what is the future of the DoD Silicon Valley relationship? Should we enact this policy, are not the things we can directly measure. And if we can't directly measure it, we can't forecast it. And the things that we can directly measure, that we can forecast, are not themselves the things that are really driving policy decisions. So we need to find a way to bridge that gap. The second problem is the so what. The people that we're typically trying to inform, the policymakers, are not, for the most part, forecasters. They're unfamiliar with a lot of these tools. A lot of them are not particularly quantitatively inclined. So we can't simply show them a whole bunch of forecast data and expect them to use that in their decision-making process. And to figure out what to communicate to them, we have to really understand what are the most salient takeaways from this process. So these are the problems that we've been trying to solve. Our current best guess as to how to solve them is this issue campaign process. And again, this is a work in progress, so please help us make it even better. In short, it's a two-stage process that involves both the stakeholders, the people we want to inform, and the crowd. So we combine both sources of judgment. We use the former to decompose the problem and figure out what to forecast, and we use the latter as a source of truth to figure out what's actually going on. So the stakeholder stage, I think broadly has 3 steps. The first step is we talk to the stakeholders, and these are, often they're subject matter experts, but they need not be. They're people for whom this question is something in which they're professionally interested. Many of these people work for or formerly worked for the Department of Defense. Some are industry professionals, some are academics. So they have a professional interest in this topic. And so we interviewed them to understand how they think about the topic. And what we really wanted to do was figure out how they would break down the topic, because we want our breakdown to track their breakdown. If we present to them a bunch of factors and drivers that are unfamiliar to them, it'll be less useful. So we want to track their understanding of the topic as well as possible. Through these interviews, we ask them, how would you actually measure the state of the DoD Silicon Valley relationship 5 years from now? We call these outcome measures. And we settled on transactions between DoD and Silicon Valley, and what we're calling personnel, which is basically DoD's access to the talent developed within the private US tech sector. And then we also asked, if imagine this dynamic was really good in 5 years, or imagine it was really bad in 5 years, what's different between those two worlds? What are the key features of the world that are driving this relationship? And these are what we're calling factors. And these 7 factors here are the most commonly cited ones. And these are plain language trends that hopefully will be applicable to other use cases as well. China military aggression, strength of the US tech sector, US political polarization. And we're kind of jumping ahead here, but the colors of the factors represent the relationship, according to the stakeholders, between the factors and the outcome. Green means if the factor increases, the relationship will improve. Red means the opposite. And yellow means they're split on the effect of a change in that factor. The second step is we metricize these factors and outcome measures with forecastable questions. And again, these forecast questions are in the weeds in many cases because they need to be falsifiable. So they're not themselves the things that the policymakers care about, but they track the things that the policymakers care about. So we can think of them as metrics, proxies. And just like when you're creating a stock index, you want to combine a bunch of imperfect measures of that overarching trend. And so that's what we did. So for each of the 7 factors and each of the 2 outcome measures, we identified between 1 and 4 forecast questions that we think collectively inform that factor or outcome measure. And here are 3 examples. Excuse me. The third step is we surveyed the stakeholders. Here we wanted to understand 3 things. So broadly, we want to map their understanding of this topic to create a rich context to understand what the crowd thinks. So first we asked them, big picture, what do you think is going to happen to the DoD Silicon Valley relationship? Do you think it's going to get better or worse? And this is not a falsifiable question. So this is not a forecast question, strictly speaking. It's not something we can resolve, but it helps us understand their overarching views so we can look for correlations between their views on individual questions and the big picture topic. Second, we asked them, how important to you is each of these factors to this relationship? And so here you see an example on the left of the stakeholder views on the importance of China military aggression. So this was viewed as a particularly important factor by the group. You can see that nearly 60% thinks it would there's a strong positive relationship between this factor and the relationship. And the views if the factor goes down is pretty similar. We also asked them to forecast each of these questions. Now, many of these stakeholders are not forecasters like yourselves. Many of them are not familiar with forecasting technique. They probably don't have, if I asked them to do what you do on 20 questions, I would have lost many of them. We also we're not relying on them for a source of truth. We're relying on their forecast to understand what they think. So we can just map the general dynamics of this issue. So we asked them simplified versions of these questions. So for the time series based questions, as you can see here in the bottom, we basically asked them a multiple choice question where we split the future into multiple bands that were determined by a quantitative prediction interval, and then asked them, where do you think this is going? And so you can see in the bottom right, 52% think it'll be in the what we're calling above trend bucket, 47% think it'll be in the on trend bucket. And then you can also see the distribution of forecasts for the South China Sea conflict question. And here you can see that they're really all over the place. We plan to summarize the stakeholder forecast for each of these questions in roughly the manner shown here, where we'll provide an aggregate forecast number, so 24% for the South China Sea question, and then a measure of disagreement. And I think this is something that has been neglected a bit when thinking about the takeaways from crowd forecasts. In many cases, the fact that people don't know is as meaningful of a takeaway as what their aggregate forecast is. To take an extreme example, if we literally had no idea what the answer was to a question, our forecast might be randomly distributed. And then the aggregate forecast really isn't that important of a takeaway. What's the important takeaway is we don't know. So we will try to generally characterize disagreement as medium, low, or high. So now we're entering the crowd stage. So the crowd, these are you folks and your people who are much more familiar with forecasting, will provide more granular, ongoing forecasts on these 20 questions, which we're just calling metrics because that's the function that they're serving. And the takeaways of the crowd phase, like why we're doing this, the way we're going to present the crowd data is, one, if the stakeholders disagree on a forecast question in a notable way, we can say that people who think the DoD Silicon Valley relationship will get better think one thing, people think it'll get worse think another. The crowd is a mechanism arbitrating that disagreement. Also, we'll find that the stakeholders, many of whom have similar backgrounds, I think most of them have spent some time at DoD, will have some correlated blind spots. And the crowd will hopefully allow us to highlight some of those. And we've seen some of this when we were comparing Cosmic Bazaar, the UK intelligence forecasts with Foretell forecasts. Now, obviously, we don't know who's correct in the case of an individual question, but if you over time see that people with a DoD background are providing higher forecasts on certain types of questions, and that turns out to be across many questions wrong, then we have reason to think that there's a correlated bias there. Also, if the stakeholders don't know the answer to a question, which is the case for many of these, their uncertainty is very high. And the crowd tends to have much less uncertainty because they're more informed forecasters. And so we actually just inject some confidence into our forecast. And lastly, the crowd will be forecasting these questions over the next 6 months. Things will change. There will be things in the world that affect the forecast. There will be some resolved questions where the crowd then comes back and updates their forecast in light of the actual outcome. And those types of landscape changes will be of value to the stakeholders. So there'll be 2 reports coming out of this. Again, as I mentioned before, we're going to have an initial report, hopefully around the beginning of October, provided we can get a critical mass of forecasts in the next few weeks. And that report will describe all the things I've been discussing, but without having the actual outcomes and without having the landscape changes component. 6 months later, we'll have a follow-on report. And for that report, we'll have some actual resolved questions, and we'll be able to note that there are certain changes for these questions in response to things that are happening in the world. And so we'll add that to the analysis. So all 20 questions for this issue campaign are using a new set of question formats that we're calling rolling question formats. And so I want to briefly talk about what those are and why we're using them. So as I mentioned, we're using forecast questions here as metrics. And what do I mean by that? What I mean is there's a landscape, part of the policy geopolitical landscape that we want to measure and forecast. When we're using forecast questions in that way, we're not looking at questions that are specific to a particular point in time. So if you're asking, for example, about what party will win the congressional election in 2022, that is a very time-bounded question. The 2022 end date is not arbitrary. There's going to be a resolution. We'll move on. We cannot continue measuring that to compare what the landscape looks like today to what it'll look like in 6 months. There's another class of questions where the end date is arbitrary. So there are 2 examples here, one in a binary format and one in a time series format. A binary example is the chance of conflict in the South China Sea. So the question on the bottom left here is one that we actually had on Foretell. It asked about the chance of conflict in the South China Sea by September 30th, 2020. That end date is arbitrary. There's no reason to think that conflict is more or less likely by that date. We just wanted to have a date roughly 6 months out so we could get some forecasts that we can actually resolve. The problem is, over the course of this question, as we got closer and closer to September 30th, even if the risk level, the thing that we actually want to measure, was constant, the forecast would go down. Because obviously, if you're forecasting the chance of conflict on September 29th, one day before the end of the forecast period, it'll be much lower. So that means that comparing forecasts over time is tricky. You really need to know when in the forecast period it was made. On the time series-based questions, most of these are kind of in the metric category. I think there are some exceptions, so I didn't bother providing a non-metric example. But an example is, how much funding will US tech startups raise? This is, again, not a question that is specific to the second half of 2021. Ideally, we'd want to be forecasting this indefinitely over multiple time periods, but we picked a 6-month time period here because that was the format available to us. We also used bins, and I'm sure you're all familiar with bins if you've been forecasting on Foretell. That's where the outcome range is divided into certain intervals, and the forecasters put a probability on each of those intervals. So in the graph on the bottom right, you can see that the 5 intervals that can be forecasted, and the chart here on the bottom left is a illustration, or it's the summary of the crowd forecasts. The bins are problematic. They're quite controversial. There's some reason to believe they might actually bias forecasters. If the bins are poorly chosen, you might end up having most of the probability mass in one bin, which provides very little granularity. My understanding is that it's not the most intuitive way to think about the forecast. If you're looking at the different numbers in the bottom left here, you might not get a general sense of whether this trend is increasing or decreasing without kind of thinking about how these numbers come together. And also, this only covers one time period. And we might want to forecast this over multiple years without having to issue the question over and over and over again. So we've addressed these problems in our new question formats. And this is how we're doing it. For binary questions, like well, in this example, it's the chance China seizes control of a Taiwanese occupied feature in the South China Sea. We don't ask it as of a certain date. We ask it for a set period of time, in this case, 6 months, and that time window moves forward over time. Practically, how it works is the 6-month window always begins on the following month. And every month, the question is effectively a new question, even though from your perspective as a forecaster, that doesn't matter. That means that the period of time you're forecasting remains constant. It's 6 months. We're measuring a 6-month risk level. And if you see changes over time, so the bottom left here is the crowd forecast. This is over a week, so no, don't put too much stock in this. That can be viewed as something like a stock ticker. These can be compared over time. And if you see a bump, it means something probably happened to make forecasters think the risk was higher. And so this question can be open indefinitely. We can close it in 6 months, or we can keep it open for years. For the time series-based questions, we're doing a couple things differently. One is we're ditching the bins. Instead, we're asking forecasters to provide a point estimate. That's the value that you think there's a 50% chance the actual value will be above and a 50% chance it'll be below. And an 80% prediction interval. So that's the range where you think there's an 80% chance the actual value will be within that range. So a 10% chance will be above, a 10% chance will be below. And that's basically a measure of uncertainty. So this is a simpler way to make a forecast for a particular time window. You're making basically 3 forecasts rather than 5. But we think it captures the things that we actually care about. So I don't think we lose much value in simplifying it. I think it's a more intuitive way to make the forecasts. And we're also providing multiple time windows in the same question format. So in this example, we're forecasting what big tech revenue will be the 4-quarter rolling average, or sorry, 4-quarter rolling sum, every 6 months for the next 3 years. So if you forecasted all 6 of these time windows, you're making 6 different forecasts. This is functionally 6 different questions. And maybe you don't want to forecast 2024. Maybe that feels too arduous. If you don't touch those dots, you haven't forecasted that question. So you're not obligated to forecast that question. Every 6 months, we will resolve one of these questions and a new 6-month window will open up. So just like the binary format, in principle, this question could remain open indefinitely. And you can look at it and see the crowd forecast in the same format, providing a general several year forecast with lots of checkpoints in between so we can actually get reality checks. Okay, I would open up to questions now, but just so for your record keeping, I've referenced several different resources on the Foretell site. We have a main page for the DoD Silicon Valley issue campaign. That's probably your home base for this. We currently have a graphic that shows all the factors and outcome measures, the results of the stakeholder survey for the factors. We will soon have an additional level showing the results of the stakeholder forecast for each of the questions. Basically what I just showed you in this presentation. They're not up yet, probably next week. The second link is a blog post we issued that kind of summarizes the result of the stakeholder phase. Third link is just all the questions for this issue campaign. Again, we have 13 up now, but there will be 20. And last, we have a blog post on these new question formats if you want to learn a bit more about them. So that, I will open it up to questions.